Morning everyone, it's Sharon here from Climate Action North, and I'm delighted to welcome our next guest today, Dr David Hetherington, who's going to talk to us about everything that David is involved in at the moment. So welcome David, how are you?
Good morning, Sharon. I'm very well, thanks. Yes, I'm slowly getting used to being back in a working week. I've been off work for the last couple of weeks, and of course I'm now having to fight my way through this bulging inbox and various deadlines, but I thought I would take a little bit of time out of my diary to talk to you today anyway.
Thank you, and we do appreciate it. So are you actually back physically at work, or are you still working at home? Are you?
Yeah, in the new normal, I'm in the new office, which of course is my study at home. I've been working here since March, and actually I'm kind of getting used to that. I'm quite happy with that. There's been the odd incident with my toddler son battering the door down in the middle of a Zoom meeting, as I'm sure many people have had to spot with that sort of thing. And occasionally, meetings get disturbed by somebody delivering a parcel, and that's life now. So yeah, we're not back in the office, and I'm probably unlikely to be so this year actually, by the looks of it. We can go in for very specific things to pick something up, but generally speaking, we're all pretty much working from home.
Yeah, it's a good thing actually. I quite like working from home. I find it quite sort of I'm quite disciplined as well. I don't know whether you are, but I'm quite disciplined in working from home. So it is quite a good thing to do. And you can certainly plan your day a little bit better, and we don't have to travel anywhere. So that's pretty good as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, that is a good thing. I have to say my commute to work, however, was a half an hour walk, which was some pretty much needed exercise. So if anything, I've probably come a little bit lazier because I can stay in bed for that bit longer and I'm not getting my walk in. My inadvertent exercise isn't happening. So I'm now having to make more of an effort to actually get out there and get some fresh air, stretch the legs and get some exercise.
Oh, well, you need to make time for exercise, David, even if it's just walking around the garden or something, which is
Yeah.
what I tend to do. I tend to sort of try and fit a little bit of exercise in each day, even if it's just half an hour away from the computer, which is always a good thing to do.
Well, I mean, I'm lucky in terms of where I live. I mean, I can just walk out the door. I mean, I live in a wee glen in the Cairngorms National Park, so I can walk out the door and go for a walk in some, beautiful birch woods and see, all manner of wildlife. I'm hoping again I'll have the experience I had not that long ago where I saw both a golden eagle and a white-tailed eagle together. And so, yeah, there are not many people, I suppose, who are lucky enough to be able to see that sort of thing from their doorstep. And it hasn't happened terribly often, but, I do see the occasional, badger or otter or raptor flying around. So that's all good stuff.
Oh, you definitely need to do a blog of some kind, actually, when you've got that on your doorstep. You need to tell us about what you're seeing each day. I think that would be amazing. Yeah, I mean, it's not many people who can say they have that diversity on their doorstep. You could call it diversity on your doorstep, really, couldn't you?
I suppose it could. What I tend to get more directly in the garden are red squirrels. We get them every day, and roe deer in the garden pretty much every day, munching their way through the geraniums. So I actually really like roe deer. I think they're a beautiful animal, so I don't mind them taking some of the geraniums, but there's certainly quite a lot of them around here.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, that leads me on to a question actually I had for you, which was about the national park. So I know that you work for Cairngorms National Park. I mean, how long have you been there now, David? How long have you worked for the organisation?
I've worked for them now for 15 years. It was the first job that I applied for after I finished my PhD. And bingo, got it first time. So I've been here since then. I've worked in a variety of different things and a number of different roles. So I have worked on kind of development related things in the past. I've worked on projects to do with raptor conservation, water vole conservation, capercaillie, of course, which is a big conservation objective here in the national park. And then I spent 3 years working specifically on a wildcat conservation project. And then these days, I am the Woodland Advisor. So what I'm trying to do is bring about large-scale, primarily native woodland expansion within the national park, and trying to do that in a joined-up way so we can maximise our ecological bang for our buck, if you like. And of course, most of the national park is private land. So it is about working with private landowners and trying to influence them, facilitate them, support them to deliver that type of thing. And so that's really exciting because there's a lot going on at the moment with woodland. and indeed peatland, which is another great way of responding to the climate emergency, is to restore the many damaged peatlands that we've got. But yeah, planting native woodlands and indeed natural regeneration, it's not all about planting. In fact, just yesterday I was speaking to my colleagues in Scottish Forestry, and they've recorded 1,800 hectares of new woodlands since October in the national park, which is probably many times what England has had for quite some time, and that's just what we've had in the national park in the last few months. And out of those 1,800, 1,400 were actually achieved through natural regeneration, which is a pretty good way of ensuring you get the right tree in the right place. So that's quite a distinctive feature. There's two distinctive features, I guess, about woodland in the national park is A, just how much of it is native. Actually, when you look around Scotland, and if you look at all the local authority areas in the two national parks, the average component of the total woodland resource that is native, it is on average something like 25% for those areas. But in the Cairngorms National Park, it's 69%. You know, it's the only place where it's majority native. And unusually, again, you know, much of that native woodland expansion that is happening here is happening not through planting, but through natural regeneration. So some really exciting stuff happening. So I'm largely working on trees these days, but I do still have a sideline in cats. I sit on the project management board of a new project called Saving Wildcats, which is just in the process of starting now. It probably would have started a little bit earlier, but unsurprisingly, COVID has kind of caused inevitable delays. But it's an EU Life funded project, so we were able to avail ourselves of EU funding just before we Brexited. And there's going to be a big focus on stepping up the captive breeding of wildcats, using animals that are currently in captivity and perhaps bringing animals in from outside the UK as well, and very much modelling on the project on what the Spanish and Portuguese have done with the Iberian lynx in Iberia. And in fact, the Junta de Andalucía is one of our partners. It's very much an international partnership. We've got partners from Spain, we've got partners from Sweden, and several organisations within Scotland. So that's an exciting project that will be unfolding over the next few years. So captive breeding, and then of course translocating the animals into the wild to boost the highly and critically endangered wildcat populations that we have in the wild here.
Oh, two exciting prospects there actually that I've just noted. I mean, in terms of the trees, David, you know, when you're talking about the natural regeneration, you're having sort of mostly obviously you talked about native trees. I mean, what species are they? Can you sort of explain which species they are?
So yeah, I mentioned it's probably mostly native, which isn't to say that of course there aren't going to be non-native productive forests getting planted as well. So we do tend to find, you know, the number one most common tree in Scotland is actually the Sitka spruce, which is native to North America. And in some parts of Scotland, that's very predominantly the most abundant tree. Less so in the Cairngorms. The number one conifer in terms of commercial forestry over the decades and indeed centuries has been the Scots Pine, which of course is a native tree which grows particularly well in the soils and climate that we have here in the Cairngorms. So that, you know, the fact that we have large remnant Caledonian pine woods, coupled with the fact that we had the Scots Pine as the conifer of choice for forestry has, I think, resulted in us having such a high proportion of natives in our woodland component. In terms of the woodland expansion that's happening either through planting or through regeneration now, much of it being native, then yes, Scots Pine is definitely a big part of that, as are, of course, you know, our birch species, both downy birch, silver birch. We're seeing willows increasingly being talked about and thought about, and indeed being planted at the higher elevations to try and bring back a more scrub-like tree line. In some of the more riparian areas, when we have quite a lot of alder trees going in. Aspen is a tree that we're really interested here in the Cairngorms. It is found, you know, throughout Britain, but I would suggest that in terms of the rare and endangered flora and fauna associated with aspen, and there are various things from moths to hoverflies and mosses to lichens that are dependent on aspen. The Cairngorms National Park is really the mothership in terms of all that rare stuff. We have a lot of aspen trees here, some really big impressive stands, and a lot of biodiversity that you just don't find in other parts of the UK. So we're really keen to try and expand, well, first of all, to find out where all that aspen is, and then try and strategically identify how we might join it all up better to make sure that the species stay safe. So that's another big part of what we're trying to do here. And of course, things like rowan trees are fantastic because they produce berries that feed birds and small mammals. With hazels, if we can get hazels in, they produce nuts. Again, that's really good for small mammals. And of course, small mammals are driving the ecosystem in many ways. They're food for things like kestrels and buzzards and owls and your smaller predators like pine martens and stoats and wildcats, of course. So so all sorts of things we need to think about. We've got a really big palette of native species that we can be working with, and they're all part of the mix for sure.
That's great, because obviously I was thinking about the actual enormity of the task for actually mapping out what is actually in the Cairngorms National Park. It's a huge job, isn't it? I mean, I assume it has been done over many, many years, but actually mapping out what's already there, what needs to be planted, what needs to be enhanced, what needs to be taken away, what needs to be cleared. It must be a huge ongoing job at all times. You must be constantly mapping, constantly changing, constantly maintaining, such an area. It's a huge job, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's a very large area, the national park. It's by far and away the biggest national park in the UK. It's twice the size of the next largest, which is the Lake District, and it's one of the biggest in Europe. So 6% of Scotland's land surface. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Mapping woodlands is a big ongoing task, and we are very much still doing that. There is a national data set, the National Forest Inventory, that gets updated every year by the latest grant scheme information that the Scottish Forestry hold. They update that every year. But it only maps woodlands that are above a certain size, above 0.5 hectare, and only woodlands above a certain canopy cover, 20% canopy cover. And as ever, there will be the odd glitch in the data set, but we do use that quite a bit. But what we've done recently is we got a young lad in on an internship to basically go across the whole of the national park using aerial photographs to identify the kind of small remnants, the trees outside woodland. So the stuff under 0.5 hectare, or perhaps stuff that the national data set has missed, or scattered trees that are below 20% canopy cover. So he's done a fantastic job of mapping the eastern side of the national park and picking out all these, little clumps of birches and rowans that are clinging to some gully deep in the mountains that haven't been mapped before. And it's really useful to know where these things are, because when we get the ideal conditions for natural regeneration, perhaps reduced grazing pressures, then of course these remnants can act as seed sources, and we can start to look at woodland expansion in some of these areas using the existing seed sources. And many of the remnants are along stream sides and gullies and river sides. And we're certainly really interested in expanding riparian woodland, because we believe, in terms of bang for your buck, you get a lot of good stuff out of riparian woodland, whether it's helping to stabilise slopes that are getting eroded, whether it's natural flood management by slowing down water flow into the watercourses, which can have beneficial effects further downstream, or whether it's actually shading watercourses against the rigours of climate change, particularly in the summer months. Because that's certainly one thing that we're noting here, is that water temperature in our mountain streams is going up and up. The fishery community back 100 years ago were throwing their hands up in horror because they'd recorded a temperature in the upper River Dee of 16 degrees centigrade. More recently, water temperatures have been recorded above 27 degrees in the same watercourse. So if they were worried about the effects that was going to have on salmon 100 years ago, they should be really terrified about it now. And actually, many of the fishery boards are working very positively with private landowners to increase the distribution of riparian trees, so that they will grow up and start to cast shade on those watercourses in the years to come. And it's not just about shade, of course. They provide leaf litter, which drops into the watercourses, provides nutrients, and that will feed the aquatic ecosystem, the invertebrates, and ultimately the fish. So it's all good stuff. And of course, like I say, if you're planting trees along a watercourse and you're doing that for several kilometres, what you're effectively doing as a bit of a byproduct is creating a series of stepping stones and corridors of woodland, albeit quite narrow ones, through an otherwise treeless landscape, and helping to strengthen a forest habitat network across the national park. And we're really keen to see that happen.
Yeah, I mean, because I recently you'd be quite proud of me actually. I recently did some training on restoring temperate forests and stuff, and actually was, you know, looking at ecosystem restoration and stuff, and learning more about, you know, plantation forests and how natural regeneration and natural you know, I suppose the tree collection as well. It's about collecting some of the seeds and actually the saplings that are growing, and, you know, transplanting them somewhere else and stuff like that, and looking at all of the mycorrhizal network as well, which was just like mind-blowing really when you think about how everything works as part of the ecosystem. It's fascinating, isn't it, really, to think that everything has a place in the ecosystem, and like you just said about leaf mold and, you know, everything having a purpose. It's quite incredible really, isn't it? You don't just think of a forest as being a forest, you think of it as a network of so many other things that, you know, feed into each other. So I suppose, I mean, in terms of the national park as well, when you're planting out, you know, planting to supplement, you know, some of the natural and the native species that are there, is it a journey to get there to plant? Because I always think about, you know, tree planting as being, it's great, you just rock up, you plant a load of trees and you go. But I know that from other projects that I've been involved in before, there's a journey to get there. You have to walk for miles before you can actually plant the trees and then come back out of the, you know, the area. Is that typical of the national park when you're replanting, or is it fairly straightforward to do that?
Yeah, there's a variety of different schemes that have been going on across the national park, and I guess if you want to do strategic woodland creation, you're not necessarily being guided by where you would ideally like to do trees, simply because it's easy, because it's right next to the road. You can park your car and cross the fence and stick a tree in the ground. Sometimes you want to see woodland expansion happening in areas that are deep into the, you know, perhaps into the mountains, and you're a long way away from a tarmac road, and you might even be a long way away from a vehicle track, and so that is a challenge. And in some cases, you know, we're having to fly. Well, not we, but, you know, some of the estates that are doing woodland creation are having to fly stuff in by helicopter, which is perhaps not brilliant from a carbon point of view, but in some cases it's the only real way of getting things like, you know, really big straining posts for fences into the landscape, and other materials required for planting. Yeah, I mean, we have planting is quite a resource intensive way of doing things in many ways. You know, we have to, you know, typically, and this is the model that's typical of much of Scotland, is you're creating a fenced exclosure. That requires a lot of metal fencing, it requires a lot of fence posts, it may require vehicles and even helicopters to put that stuff in. And this is all to try and keep deer and other herbivores out of your newly planted woodland. And then of course, when you're planting a tree, arguably you could be disturbing carbon-rich soils and then putting the tree in there. So in many ways, planting is not the ideal way of doing things. The ideal way would be natural regeneration, using existing seed sources to allow nature to do it itself in a much more unobtrusive way. But we don't always have that luxury because there maybe isn't a seed source around. You know, we have to create that seed source, and in some instances, the herbivore pressures are still too high to allow trees to be planted without, or indeed to regenerate without some sort of protection. So yeah, we're still on a journey. There's definitely a direction of travel in terms of herbivores and the amount of woodland expansion. But yeah, woodland creation can be quite tricky for sure. There's all sorts of constraints you've got to think about, particularly somewhere like this. It's a highly designated landscape for all sorts of things, whether it's birds that like open habitats, whether it's open habitats themselves can be designated. There can be archaeology, there's landscape concerns. We have to make sure we're not planting trees on deep peat, because you're not allowed to do that. And of course, that has a negative carbon impact. So all sorts of constraints we need to think about. So yeah, tree planting is not always terribly straightforward.
Totally agree. And I'm pleased you said that, because like I say, we at Climate Action North, we did a whole blog about planting the right tree in the right place, the right time, for the right reasons as well. So it was all about, you know, there are a bit like the old carbon offsetting days when we were around in the original climate action or climate change offsetting days, when there was so many easy ways to offset your carbon footprint, of which it was just a lot of greenwashing as well. So we wanted to try and raise awareness of tree washing. We called it tree washing. So we made sure that, you know, not that we are tree planting experts, of course we're not, but we make sure that people who are planting trees are getting the right information and the advice from the ecologists and from the people who look after the landscape, and making sure exactly what you've just said, that you're not, you know, compromising another ecosystem by just planting a load of trees on in an area. So and that sort of brings me to another bit of a question about trees as well, because I know that you are still a board member for Trees for Life, David. Are you still a board member there?
I am, yeah, yeah.
They're doing some amazing work, aren't they? They've got quite a lot of projects with the, you know, obviously Glen Afric stuff, and then they've got the Rewilding Center. And I thought I did read that they were they doing a seed bank as well? Were they doing some seed work, seed collection work?
Yeah, I mean, Trees for Life, for those folks who don't know, is a fairly small, I suppose, charity based in the north of Scotland that has been very focused on native woodland expansion, but not just the trees. They're also looking more widely at some of the species that live in our native woodlands, whether those are plants or birds or mammals. And so they have for many years been working in Glen Afric alongside the then Forestry Commission, largely on Forestry Commission ground, but also of course on some of the private estates. A little over 10 years ago, they bought their own estate in a glen called Glen Morriston. So they've been able to play around, if you like, with their own bit of grounds. They're not beholden to other people. And they've been doing some fantastic woodland creation work there, including not just, you know, the high forest, you know, that we think of, you know, birches and pines and rounds and whatnot, but also the kind of wee trees, if you like, the more scrubby stuff that grows on the higher ridges and the more exposed ground, you know, the dwarf birches, the juniper, the montane willows. And it was very exciting to see that for the first time in 40 years, a pair of golden eagles has successfully bred at the estate at Dundregan, which is great. And that was actually hands-on conservation. They actually built a nest platform a few years back in the hope that golden eagles might come back and nest on the reserve, and now they have, which is fantastic. So I think the charity is certainly going from strength to strength. They are working with an increasing number of private estates more widely across the Highlands, and dipping their toes into all sorts of things. So red squirrel reintroductions is something that Trees for Life have been really involved with. So there are parts of the North and Western Highlands which, although they've got forests, they're actually quite isolated from forests further south and further east, and red squirrels have not been able to recolonise suitable habitat there. And so Trees for Life have been involved in taking red squirrels from areas where they're quite numerous and common, and moving them out and working very much with local communities to do that. And that's been wildly successful. Local communities are really excited to see red squirrels coming into their areas. And of course, you know, they can come into people's gardens, they can be seen, the school kids are loving it. And it's a real positive sign that, you know, that things are improving, the ecology is getting better. So that's another example of what they're up to. You mentioned the Rewilding Center. That's a big project that is a planning application has been submitted with a local authority to remodel some buildings on their site at Dundregan to create a new all singing, all dancing facility that will be really quite a welcoming facility where people can come and can learn about rewilding, specifically about the work that Trees for Life are doing on the reserve and more widely. It'll have a cafe, it'll have classrooms, it'll be a good educational facility as well, and very much hooked up with on the public transport network, so people don't need a car to get there. So it's all good stuff. So that's an exciting project that they're doing. And another project they're doing is called East West Wild. And that, again, it's largely centered around that Glen Afric area, but it's not just working on that Forestry Commission estate. It's working with a wide range of local private landowners and local communities to do kind of landscape scale conservation, with, I suppose, the headline aim, as the name of the project suggests, of connecting up the woodlands on the eastern side of Glen Afric, which drain into the North Sea, with those woodlands on the west coast, which are sitting in river catchments that drain into the Atlantic. So it's trying to connect up woodland right across the Highlands from east to west. So another great project. So exciting times. Yeah, Trees for Life are going from strength to strength. So for those folks who are not familiar with Trees for Life, by all means, check them out, their website and their social media.
Definitely, I will be sharing the Trees for Life information as well, because I think you're right. They are really doing some excellent work. I think they've got this Trees for Life scheme where you can buy your own piece of woodland as well. Well, buy your own plot, I suppose, can't you? And then have your trees planted there.
It,
I mean, I
it's
know
not,
people that are doing that and people who are actually planting
yeah.
trees as part of
It's not so much buying a plot of land as such as you're paying for a grove of trees to be planted.
it.
So yeah, and people can pay for a tree or they can pay for a grove, and they can keep on adding to their grove of trees as time goes on. You know, every time there's a birthday or some sort of family event, or every time somebody does something, they can create more trees on their plot on Dundragon. So yeah, absolutely, that's a great way for people to feel that they're contributing to the rewilding of the Highlands, and I've done that myself. And I should say, going back to your point there you made earlier on, that at Dundragon they also have a really interesting tree nursery, where they do a lot of really good work with some of the more obscure trees that perhaps are not given so much focus on the bigger, more commercial nurseries. They do a lot of work with aspen. They do a lot of work with the montane willows, with dwarf birch, and they're even moving into some of the plants like twinflower, and doing that sort of conservation work in the nursery, and then of course translating them into the wild and doing that exciting restoration stuff.
Fantastic. Because isn't twinflower quite an old species as well, isn't it? One that has been there for a lot of years or something, and then it was coming back. Because I read something about that as well, about the twinflower.
Yeah, I mean, twinflower is a really beautiful, very distinctive plant. As the name suggests, it's kind of got these sort of double head to it, and if you only ever see photographs of them, you kind of get the impression that they're about a foot or two tall. And then when you go looking for them in the woods, knowing that there are twinflower in the woods, you don't find them, because you're looking for something way bigger than it actually is. It's a tiny little thing about this high, and it's in amongst the ground vegetation. So they're very delicate little things, but very pretty, and a real, I suppose, flagship species in many ways, in terms of the Caledonian pine woods in particular. And we do have twinflower around about where I am today. So it is easily overlooked because of how small it is, but there are new populations being discovered in a few places, and there's a new conservation project actually just been launched here in the Cairngorms to work with a variety of different habitat types to do with plants, so flower-rich meadows, the Arctic alpine stuff on top of the mountains, but also some of the flora living in our pine woods, and the twinflower is one of the species that we're definitely looking at, because there are genetic issues. It's not necessarily very good at spreading around and mixing up populations. There's some kind of small, quite isolated populations, so there's really interesting work going on with the genetics and trying to mix things up to try and give it a genetic boost that it will start reproducing more vigorously.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I love the sound of that as well. I would love to keep in touch with the projects about that, because I think it's just fascinating that we are looking at preserving species that should be looked after. I suppose in terms of climate change, though, David, are you seeing a lot of challenges around adapting? You have to adapt your planting as well to adapting to climate change, I suppose. Some of the things that you may have thought would have worked in a normal scenario or a normal situation, are you having to adapt where you plant, what you plant? Obviously, when you talk about peatlands and areas that might seem okay for the trees, or were okay for the trees many years ago in Caledonian forest or whatever, are you seeing a lot of difference now with the adaptation we have to make in terms of climate change, like you say, rising temperatures of water and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think there are quite a few considerations now with regard to woodland that climate change forces upon us, and we've talked about the need to try and shade our water courses from the rising water temperatures, which will essentially kill off the fish, kill off the salmon, and affect the freshwater pearl mussels that live in there. So it's important to think about those things. And the other thing, of course, we're thinking about is that we may see the need for species to move northwards in response to climate change. And if they're woodland species, and if the woodlands don't run from south to north and can't allow them to get to the north, then that's a problem. So when we're looking at our forest habitat network in and around the Cairngorms, we want to make sure that a lot of the potential corridors and stepping stones that we're putting in are north to south aligned that can allow species to do that. I suppose one thing that may well happen from climate change, but which I suspect was going to happen anyway, because I think we're still recovering from centuries, if not millennia, of heavy grazing pressures, is we'll probably see trees moving further up the hill than they have in the past. And I can talk at length about that separately if you like. On a more detailed level, I mean, we have, of course, had some quite extreme weather events in the last few years. You know, we've had, you know, incredibly wet summers or incredibly windy, stormy periods, or we have long droughts, and that can all affect the effectiveness of woodland creation. And I've seen it with a site not far from here where it was mounded. So by that, you're basically scooping a hole out of the ground, and you're taking that the soil you've taken out, and you're putting it in a wee pile next to the hole, and you stick your tree into that pile of soil. And that's quite a common way of creating particularly native woodland, is this thing called hinge mounding. Well, shortly after that was all hinge mounded and planted, we then had a long drought. And of course, those young trees are then in this little mound of exposed soil getting baked. And I think we saw a lot of trees dying because of a long, prolonged drought period. There are probably ways of planting trees where that would make them less vulnerable to that, to be fair. And interestingly, there was a scheme right next door to that one where they chose a different method of ground preparation, where they didn't have hinge mounding and then planting in a wee hill. And they didn't suffer anything like the number of losses. In fact, I don't think they suffered any losses. So there are ways of safeguarding against it, but it gives you an idea of the sorts of considerations we have to have in a changing climate.
Yeah, and it's not going to be one size fits all either, is it, David? You know what I mean? It's going to be, everything's different for the situation that you're in. So fascinating.
Yeah.
I find the whole subject of tree planting quite fascinating, because I think it isn't just about that one simple task, is it? It's the whole thing has to be considered as part of a much bigger project, I suppose. And I do sort of quite find that fascinating. I'm looking forward to planting our trees. We've got some trees that we're going to plant in a small rewilded area here in County Durham, on a farm that's been rewilded. So looking forward to that. It should be quite interesting.
Yeah.
So tell me about, because I'm quite interested in David the person. David, how did you get into being an ecologist, and how did you get into working into what you were doing? Was it something you were always interested in when you were young, or did you want to be something else?
It's a good question. I don't think I've taken a terribly typical career path to get to where I am today. You know, I was never good at science at school. I didn't do a biology degree when I went to university. And actually, I was always much better at things like languages and history and geography. And I remember when I was about 5 or 6 telling the world that I wanted to be an archaeologist. You know, I wanted to go and discover Tutankhamun's tomb, or, well, obviously that had already been discovered, but something like that. I've been really fascinated by the past, but I've always been really interested in wildlife at the same time. And I think that's kind of led to this sort of the place where I'm at the moment. Is I ended up doing an environmental geography degree as my first degree at the University of Aberdeen, and then I went away and worked for 5 or 6 years after university. And it was during that time I actually worked for an organisation called Highland Birchwoods, which was based on the Black Isle near Inverness. And I was using some of my kind of geographical interests. We were mapping woodlands using remote sensing, using aerial photographs to try and create a national data set in Scotland of, you know, all its woodland cover. And it was whilst I was looking at, you know, day in, day out, looking at maps and aerial photographs of woodland cover at a large scale, at a strategic level, I started to wonder, you know, well, we're obviously reforesting here in Scotland and have been for about a century or so, but do we have enough well-connected habitat to support a viable population of a large, mobile, forest-dwelling animal? And of course, what I had in mind was the lynx. A species I've long been fascinated by, I would argue since a very young age. And I should say that me wondering about whether we had forest habitat for lynx led me to think about where I'm going next with my career. And I thought, I know, I'll go back to university and I'll do some sort of postgraduate thing exploring the feasibility of lynx reintroduction in Scotland. So I thought, oh well, I'll just do that then. So I I got in touch with Roy Dennis, who some of you will know is a very well-respected practical nature conservationist who's done a heck of a lot of work over the decades, especially with raptors. He's been highly involved in osprey conservation for a long, long time, and has been very involved in the recent white-tailed eagle reintroduction to the Isle of Wight. So I got in contact with Roy because I knew he was really interested in the whole idea of mammal reintroductions as well as birds. And I said, look, Roy, is there anybody out there you think might be able to fund a sort of postgraduate degree in, for me to go and look at lynx reintroduction? And he said, well, I think I might be able to fund that with my foundation. So, well, bingo, there we go again. So I was pretty jammy, and within, with a few months, he was able to get me funding that allowed me to start a PhD at the University of Aberdeen, because I'd got in contact there with Martin Gorman in the zoology department, who I'd heard give presentations at Mammal Society conferences about the implications of wolf reintroduction in Scotland. I thought, well, he's kind of interested in this stuff. So I phoned him up and said, look, would I be able to do some sort of postgraduate looking at lynx? I don't actually have a zoology degree. I said, I've got an environmental geography degree. And he said, well, was it a 2-1? I said, yeah. I said, well, that'll do. He said, have you got funding? Yeah. I said, right, fine. So that was that then. So I then embarked on a PhD, as it turned out, eventually, in exploring the feasibility of lynx reintroduction in Scotland. And I have to say, like I say, I've had this affinity with lynx for a very long time. And it was interesting. There's a photograph, there was a photograph of my granny's house when I was growing up of me as a toddler, aged about 1 year old. And I was sitting in this photograph on my granny's back lawn, right next to her lawnmower. And apparently, according to the family, I used to show an awful lot of interest in this lawnmower. And of course, my dad and my grandfather were engineers, mechanical engineers and whatnot. And they obviously thought, well, that's my boy, like father, like son. He's got an interest in the built environment and how things work. So then they bought me a mechano set and all this sort of stuff for this fledgling engineer that I was about to be. But of course, sadly, it was apparent that I had neither any interest nor aptitude in anything to do with engineering or anything practical, and the mechano set was largely ignored. And so it was a bit of a mystery as to why I always was so fascinated by this lawnmower. But actually, it became much more apparent in adulthood when I was clearing out my granny's shed, and I found the grass collection bucket from this old lawnmower, and it was made by a company called Qualcast, and the maker's logo was a nice, colourful, it was a golden coloured spotty cat. It was a leopard. And that was on right in the front of the grass collection bucket. And that, I have no doubt in my mind now, was what, as a 1-year-old, I was so fascinated by. It wasn't a lawnmower, it was the spotty, golden coloured cat. So, fast forward 27 years, and here am I going into Aberdeen University to do my PhD on lynx reintroduction in Scotland. And I also remember when I was 6, sitting in the back of my dad's car, we're driving around the Highlands, and it was the same year where Felicity the puma had been caught in a cage near Glen Africa, as it turns out, and was taken into captivity at the Highland Wildlife Park. So I was fascinated by the idea that there were big cats out there. And I remember giving my dad quite a bit of a shock from the back seat, piping up and saying, "Oh, Dad, I've just seen a bobcat." And he's like, "What? Wait, are you sure?" And I said, yeah, I just saw a bobcat. And of course I hadn't, and I knew fine I hadn't. What I had seen was a fallen birch tree's trunk, which in my mind, I'd kind of looked a bit like a bobcat, which of course is a kind of lynx. So I knew I was kind of kidding my dad on, but I really wanted to see a bobcat in the Scottish countryside, this member of the lynx family. So I would argue my interest in kind of big cats and the potential for them to be in Scotland has been there with me for a very long time. But my interest in things like languages and history and geography have all fused into that, because my PhD was very multidisciplinary. It was geographical because I was having to use GIS to map out the abundance and distribution of lynx habitat. But equally, one of the first things I had to do was identify, was the lynx ever actually living in Britain? Is it native here? And that led me to dig into the history, into the past. And that's something I'm still fascinated by as an ecologist, is that dimension of time. What happened in the past and what implications are there for the present day and indeed the future of what happened in the past. And my interest in languages meant I was digging into, you know, books about medieval Welsh poetry and Scottish Gaelic and Anglo-Saxon, looking for clues and place names and things like that, which I all, you know, kind of melded together to hopefully paint a much clearer picture of what happened to lynx in the past and what their relationship was with humans, and therefore what the implications are for reintroduction. So, like I say, I've not taken a terribly typical career path. It's kind of wound its way, but I've been quite fortunate, quite lucky, and I've ended up being able to do what I want.
That's brilliant. I love that story. I didn't know that. So it's like fascinating to the insight behind the Lynx man. We call you the Lynx man because you are the Lynx man. And of course, we come to this, which like everybody must have a copy of this book now. I'm sure everyone must have a copy of it. So that brings us to lynx. I was going to ask you about the lynx, and obviously you've explained that your interest and affinity with the lynx goes way, way back with that sort of species. I mean, that is a brilliant book as well. So what led you to write the book? Were you just so interested in finding everything out, like, you know, what you've done, what you've researched and everything? And the photography as well is just incredible, David, isn't it? I mean, it's just a lovely, lovely book, and a real way of bringing that species into our sort of front rooms, and when, you know, in our offices when we're reading about it. It's just a fascinating book. It's really well written and everything. So
well, thanks, Sharon. I'm glad you like it. It's very pleasing to hear that. And again, there's an element of it kind of falling into my lap in a way. So I suppose there are two main reasons why I sort of wrote that book. One is, well, I definitely felt there was a need for a book. I mean, like I say, I'd done my PhD on lynx. I'd spent quite a bit of time going around Europe, speaking to lynx biologists, getting a feel for the landscapes that they were living in, the sorts of issues that could arise. And of course, what's happened in the last sort of, you know, in the time since I finished my PhD, is the lynx has gone from an animal that we had very little understanding of and recognition of as having been a former native here, and there was very little discussion about its reintroduction, to now being an animal that is getting talked about far, far more. And, you know, there's you know, it seems barely a month goes by without somebody trying to reintroduce lynx to this country. And of course that generates, quite understandably, a lot of discussion, whether it's in, you know, the local pub or whether it's on social media or in the newspapers. But what was quite clear to me was that the level of knowledge and understanding about the species was actually very low, and that included, you know, in perhaps some of the proponents for lynx reintroduction, and as well as some of the opponents who were, I think, making assumptions as well. And of course the truth lies somewhere in between. You know, the proponents were overly positive and the opponents were overly negative, and the truth lies somewhere in between. You know, lynx can cause issues, but they're not the devil incarnate, just as much as they're not angels. So I thought, well, there is definitely a need to take knowledge and understanding from continental Europe, where they have still got lynx, and where indeed many countries have reintroduced them in the last few decades, and produce that in a way, in a sort of non-technical way and in a balanced way. That was really important for me as well, was to sort of, you know, show everything in the round and talk about the problems as much as the opportunities, but make sure people understood the lynx better, how it lives, you know, what it eats, how it eats, and some of the impacts it can have on rural land use, for example. So there's definitely a gap in the market for that. And so that's what I'm trying to do, is trying to better inform that national discussion. I have to say, there was an element of opportunism here as well, because the fantastic photographs that you mentioned, they are beautiful, and I can say that because I didn't take a single one of them. It was a very talented friend of mine called Laurent Gélin, who is French, but lives in Switzerland. And I first met Laurent a few years ago in Switzerland when I was out there sort of accompanying some of the guys doing their kind of lynx field work. They were actually trying to trap a lynx for a reintroduction project into Italy. And Laurent was there to, I suppose, record the whole you know, lynx project, both on stills and video. So I met him then, and didn't think much of it. But then he had already written a book about lynx, illustrated with his fantastic photographs in French, but he was quite keen to produce a book in English. And he asked the guys in Switzerland, the lynx guys, you know, is there anybody you know who could write a text for the book about lynx in English? and Friedrich Zimmermann over in Switzerland had recommended me. So Laurent said, oh yeah, that guy from Scotland. So he got in touch, said, look, do you fancy doing a book together? I said, well, yeah, absolutely, because there's a real need for it, and your photos are amazing. So the two of us worked with Scotland the Big Picture, which is a social enterprise based here in the Cairngorms National Park, that's really keen on communicating ecological restoration and rewilding through photography, through essays and stories and video. And so we spoke to them, and they said, right, okay, we'll act as the publishers. And they've got a really good eye for design and layout. So the result is a beautiful book, which I'm very pleased with it. And I think it makes a really good present for people, as well as for cat fans, nature fans, and like I say, I would hope people would find that the text is accessible and interesting, and that they'll get a lot from it. And having read it, they'll have a much stronger understanding of lynx and how they might live alongside us, and what the implications of reintroducing them to the UK might be.
Yeah, I totally agree. I love it. I think it's great. It's a great book, and I think speaking of Scotland, the Big Picture as well, obviously we all kind of know each other in that sort of sector. We're going to have them on as a speaker as well soon, so that'd be quite nice to be able to sort of link that back to here. So obviously that is leading to the ongoing interest in wildcats, and obviously being involved in the Wildcat project as well that you mentioned earlier, the Saving Wildcats project. So that's probably one to watch then, David, is it? That is kind of the closest we are becoming at the moment to that sort of near species, is to get the wildcat sorted in Scotland first, which would be great to have that as an established species, just roaming the field and doing what wildcats do,
Absolutely. I think, it would be a shame if we talked about reintroducing our extinct cat, if we let the cat that we've still got just disappear. And it is very close to disappearing. I mean, the science is evolving all the time on wildcats. So, our understanding of wildcat conservation now is very different from what it was 2 years ago, and certainly, 10 years ago. And particularly in terms of the genetics. And on the back of that, there are two significant things came out. One was, we now know that the Scottish wildcat isn't a distinctive subspecies separate from wildcats elsewhere in continental Europe, which in some ways is a shame, but actually is also an opportunity. It means we can perhaps start to think about European wildcats as something that we might be able to translocate into the UK. The other thing, of course, the issue about wildcats that we've learned from the genetics is just how desperate their situation is. And even in the last few years, their genetic status has declined really badly. So, cats get killed on the road, and people find dead cats and they get taken into the museum and they get assessed and blood samples taken, etc. And going back, say, 20 years or so, there were cats meeting the grade genetically, if you like, say 10, 20 years ago. Many of them were hybrids, it has to be said, but some of them were meeting the grade. In the last 10 years, they just aren't. It does seem that those cats that are meeting the grade just are very few and far between, if they are there at all. And so it's recently been declared functionally extinct, which isn't to say that, of course, there aren't still some wildcats out there, but it seems that the level of hybridization is so great that even if there are, one or two wildcats dotted around that meet the grade genetically, they're surrounded by a sort of sea of hybrids and domestic cats, and so you'd have to say, the game's up. So where wildcat conservation has got to now is a recognition that the status is really bad, and it is much worse in Scotland than it is in other parts of Europe where they have wildcats. There's virtually no comparison to be made in terms of how bad the situation is here. And it's not going to get any better by just leaving it to in situ conservation. There has to be this involvement of ex situ conservation, translocation to restore wildcat populations. And it's not just about Scotland either. There's a huge amount of potential to restore wildcats to other parts of the UK as well. There's plenty of decent habitat out there. Obviously, this needs to be assessed in quite a bit of detail. You know, how safe wildcats are going to be from domestic cats, from, you know, predator control, busy roads. You know, whether there's the required prey abundance. But yeah, I think we could conceivably see wildcat conservation happening not just in Scotland but in other parts of the UK, whether it's Wales and parts of England too. So yeah. I would say exciting times, but yeah, challenging times ahead for sure. There's a lot of hard work has got to be done, and like I say, the idea with saving wildcats is to take lessons that have been learned from other European countries, particularly from the Spanish, working with the Iberian lynx, which was also critically endangered, very close to extinction, and they've done some really fantastic work in averting a disaster. All hands on deck, and did a really excellent captive breeding project, which has really turned around the Iberian lynx. It's now in a much better position than it was 10 years ago. We want to take those lessons and use them for the wildcat, and learn how other European countries are dealing with wildcats and some of the issues that they're facing. And I think there's a lot we can learn from other countries' experiences.
I mean, thank goodness they've done it, really. You know what I mean? Thank goodness we've got those stories that we can share, and that best practice is actually there. So it will help the cause. I think it's really interesting about the pure genetics as well, you know, that you've said about the hybridization. It's understandable, isn't it, if you've got species that are roaming wild and other species more domesticated, I suppose. So it is a bit of a challenge, I agree. It would be.
One thing is clear. Whilst the genetic assessment of cats in the wild in the last, say, 10 years has been really alarming, and we're just not finding cats that are meeting the grade, the captive population, which has largely been taken into captivity in the 60s, 70s, maybe as late as the 80s, it is much better genetically. The levels of hybridization within the captive wildcat population are much, much lower than what you would see in the wild. And of course, if cats are showing that they've got a significant component of domestic cat within them, well, they can be removed from the breeding program. And so, it's quite easy to manage it in a captive situation, whereas you can't really manage it anything like as easily in the wild. And we know from talking to partners across Europe that a lot of the wild populations in other parts of Europe are much better genetically than we see in Scotland, and we might be able to use animals from those countries too, which isn't to say it's all a bed of roses in other countries. We do know that in some places they have got issues with hybridization, and it's not necessarily the sheer or the mere existence of domestic cats in the countryside that causes hybridization. Typically, wildcats would choose not to breed with domestic cats, and vice versa. They can often be quite behaviourally segregated. So it's not necessarily the existence of domestics that's the issue. There are other factors in the landscape that can actually make hybridization more likely. Perhaps a small size of wildcat populations. If wildcat populations have been brought to very low levels through persecution, which is exactly what happened in Scotland, then it does make hybridization more likely to happen. You're disturbing the social structures of wildcats. You're perhaps giving a male wildcat very little option other than to mate with a female domestic cat if there's no female wildcats around. And the distribution of human settlement within the countryside can be a big thing. We know, for example, in Spain, that human settlements are very nucleated in the landscape. So they're quite concentrated into the pueblos. And the domestic cats are found in the pueblo, and they don't really go more than a few hundred meters from the edge of the pueblo because it's kind of wildcat infested countryside round about. So they don't really mix. Whereas in the UK, our rural human spatial patterns are quite different. We're scattered throughout that landscape, and we may have domestic cats. And we know that we had, in the past, some really intensive predator control going on, which wiped out the wildcat from Wales and England and most of Scotland, and saw them clinging on by their claws in suboptimal habitat in this sort of, the wild craggy places of the Northwest Highlands, which I guess we've become used to thinking of as typical wildcat habitat, but actually that's not great wildcat habitat. It's a pretty harsh environment with pretty low food resources. They would much rather be somewhere probably lower down, a bit leafier, where there's a lot more voles and mice and possibly rabbits going around. So yeah, it's there's a lot we can learn, like I say, and we are still learning. We don't know it all, but it's quite a complex subject, wildcat conservation.
Well, that kind of brings us back to the landscaping and then the trees and everything else that needs, like the baseline sort of infrastructure that needs to be in place to reintroduce things like, you know, wildcats, lynx, and even trees as well. So it's brought us right full circle back to where we need to be. So, I mean, it's been a fascinating discussion, David. It really has. I've learned so much today. So thanks very much for that. And I know that you are going to hopefully still be our Trees and Bees conference speaker.
That's the plan. Yeah.
Next year, if we can get
these
that
things,
off the ground.
if we're still allowed to do all these things, yeah.
Yeah, but we are going to hopefully still have that conference, so that would be great to have you on board for that. And yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to know how many more projects you're involved in as well, because there's quite a lot of interesting projects to watch there, and hopefully you'll be able to keep us up to date with the things that you're working on as well. We'd love to hear about the exciting developments in wildcats, and I really like the idea of the East West Wild project as well. Actually, I'm going to look that up. And hopefully people who are watching, you know, this particular episode will want to get some more information, which hopefully you'll be able to share with us and we'll be able to share with everybody else. So yeah, it's been a pleasure, David. Thanks very much for your time and for telling us all about what you're doing, and hopefully you can enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Yeah, will do. Thanks very much, and thanks for having me on. It's good to have this kind of relaxed sort of chit chat about pretty much everything I'm involved in. Whereas typically I'm asked to speak about trees or I'm asked to speak about lynx. I rarely get the opportunity to sort of talk about everything in the round. So it's been a really good chat. So thanks very much for having me on.
Thank you so much, and have a nice day. Have a nice rest of the day. Speak to you soon.
All right.